Dobrý večer, vítám vás tady na dnešním staročeském dýchánku, který proběhne v angličtině, takže já se do té řeči teď taky přepnu. Welcome today here at the Old Czech party, which today we have a pleasure to host here Oren Cohen Roman from University of Haifa in Israel, who will together with our Daniel Soukup tell us something about Yiddish songs in Moravia in early modern age. Oren Cohen Roman is a research fellow at the University of Haifa. He got his PhD in 2015 at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and then he held postdoc positions at Heinrich Heine University in Düsseldorf and in Ben Gurion University of the Negev. Now he's working in particular with Yiddish literature, and I can recommend you his article published in 2018 in Interfaces about the image of fighting with lions, heroes fighting with lions, that is present in Yiddish narratives, and is in fact borrowing from Christian not only narrativity but also imagery. And it's for me it's really exquisite example of interculturation and interconnections between Jewish and Christian literatures in medieval and early modern age. So it's great pleasure for us to have you here, Oren, and the floor is yours and Daniel's. I don't know who of you will start, so please start.
Thank you very much, Mateusz. I will start. First, I have to share my presentation with you. Give me a minute. Okay. Please confirm if you see the presentation. Do you? Mateusz? Okay, I do. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. Great. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, in the spring of 1684 in Prostějov, two Moravian Jews were convicted of theft, and they were sentenced to death on March 30. This very ordinary criminal case would probably have been forgotten if a Yiddish historical song did not transform it into an instructive moral tale, setting it up as an example to be followed and thus saving it from oblivion. The main protagonists of this narrative transgressed both common law and Jewish law, both of which strictly prohibit theft. However, their stubborn refusal to be baptized, which could have saved them from capital punishment, made them martyrs and venerated heroes in the eyes of the Jewish community. In the following 60 minutes, we would like to show you how this Yiddish composition bears the stamp of early modern Jewish piety and how it was preserved and constructed in historical memory. Our presentation is divided into two parts. In the first section, I will focus on the historical context of the song and its informative function. Based on the Yiddish composition, I will try to reconstruct a hypothetical framework of the case and explain the main historical anchors in the song. In the second part, my dear colleague, Dr. Oren Cohen Roman from the University of Haifa will discuss the song in the context of early modern Yiddish literature and analyze its formative aspect, which shaped the ideal of piety and echoed a medieval ethos of Jewish martyrdom, known in Hebrew as Kiddush Hashem, or the sanctification of God's name. What do we know about this Yiddish song in general? It was written by one Chaim, the son of Shalom from Poland, who had visited Prostějov and probably witnessed the case. Unfortunately, there is no record of him anywhere else. The composition was printed following the burial of the two convicted men and was entitled "A Nice Song About Two Martyrs Who Were Recently Executed in Prostějov over the Sanctification of God's Name." Our case is unfortunately shrouded in fog. Despite searches in the archives, we have been unable to find any further documentation of the main events described in the Yiddish song. However, we did manage to locate it in external sources, certain peripheral historical events, as well as figures mentioned in the poem. Likewise, we have noticed that many details are accurate, including the song's descriptions of the town, as well as the interrogation and judicial processes. These factors grant the text, in our opinion, a certain degree of credibility. Now I will try to reconstruct what probably happened and introduce you the time, place, and main protagonists of the story. This semi-hagiographic text about two martyrs occurs in the scenery of the early modern town of Prostějov. No date is mentioned in the song. However, through historical contextualization, we were able to date it to 1684. The fortified town of Prostějov was one of the most important towns in the Moravian Margraviate, lying in a strategic position in the central region of Hana. Prostějov's Jewish community was the second largest Jewish community in Moravia in the early modern period, right after Mikulov, where the Moravian chief rabbi resided. At the turn of the 18th century, there were about 80 Jewish homes in the town. If we compare these numbers with later lists and censuses, a rough calculation suggests that around 1,500 Jews, accounting for a fourth of the town's overall population, lived in Prostějov at the end of the 17th century, when the described events took place. As was indicated earlier, a certain Leib vessel and Perez son of Avraham broke into a house in Prostějov and committed theft on the night of March 14, 1684. The song reports that the first felon, Leib vessel, was an adult man, perhaps middle age, with an infamous reputation in most Jewish communities of Moravia. This suggests that he belonged to a group of vagabond Jews who moved through the Moravian countryside, sustaining themselves either within the law or outside of it. The Yiddish song indicates that Leib had a son named Zanvel, who lived in Uherský Brod, but he was not in touch with him and did not know whether his son has been killed in the recent massacre that took place there. This massacre, described as an actual event, deserves a brief mention, especially because it enables us to date the time frame of the Prostějov narrative. Indeed, the South Moravian town was attacked by Kurd soldiers on July 16, 1683, and during the attack, 113 members of the local Jewish community were murdered. The horrors of this massacre were described in detail by an anonymous author in the powerful Yiddish elegy Churban Gadol, Great Destruction, yet another example of Moravian Yiddish literature. Moving on to the second protagonist of the text, Perez Ben Avraham. The text relates that he was 22 years old. He and his family lived in Prostějov. The song repeatedly mentions that his parents were poor and that he had to support them by making money from gambling, implying that he belonged to the margins of society. It should be noted that the song's introduction, which is moralistic in tone, strongly criticizes parents who neglect the ethical upbringing of their children indirectly condemning gambling. Moreover, the legal corpus Shaita Kanot, or the 311 statutes of the Moravian Jewish communities, formulated by secular leaders and rabbis in 1650, strictly forbade and punished not only gambling, but also other transgressions, including criminal activities like theft. In the time frame of our text, robbery, theft, and trafficking of stolen goods were all capital crimes. An entire range of criminal cases in which Jews appeared as both victims and offenders are found in chronicles, town archives, as well as in the Czech and German folk songs and broadside prints from the 17th and 18th centuries. Our song relates that the Jewish protagonists were assisted by a glazier who is not identified as a Jew, leading us to assume that he was Christian. Indeed, it was common for Jewish criminals to cooperate with Christian accomplices, as is illustrated in our Yiddish song. The Christian collaborator obviously had better knowledge of the non-Jewish environment and probably knew the daily habits of the victim. Similar patterns of such cooperation were recently analyzed by Professor Ephraim Schoensteiner in his book Jews and Crime in Medieval Europe, revealing that organized crime in the pre-modern era provided a liminal space enabling close relations between majority and minority, and that such contacts could be free of mutual prejudices. Looking at early modern court cases in the Bohemian lands, we find cases motivated by anti-Jewish sentiment, which included accusations such as blasphemy, ritual murders, or the hatred of Christianity. In such cases, we encounter details similar to those described in our song. However, we can also mention a few examples of other criminal cases without any anti-Jewish undertone. There are reports of an organized Jewish gang that committed crime more akin to pickpocketing, and thus its members were not punished so strictly. This group was connected with the Christian criminal underworld and operated on the estates of Prince von Schwarzenberg in southern Bohemia at the beginning of the 18th century. An older case is mentioned in the historical chronicle Staré letopisy České. It describes the execution of two Jews who had planned to rob the church of St. Stephen in the new town of Prague in the year 1519. Women were not spared severe punishment. The case of a Jewish lady, Regina, who was beheaded in the year 1642 and whose body was consequently burned at the stake, exhibits some similarities with previous case. Indeed, she had purchased stolen church items in Prague. Likewise, the Jewish woman Saka, who supposedly stole from a French woman attached to military regiments during the French army's occupation of Prague, was hanged in 1742. Apart from describing the theft itself, the Yiddish song also depicts gradual stages of investigation, interrogation, and punishment in detail. The cycle of inquisitions and torture is historically accurate and reflects the methods of the contemporary legal codes. Following the description of the interrogation, the song relates very little information about the trial, mainly focusing on its outcome. Leib Wessel and Perez Ben Avraham were sentenced to death by hanging, and the Christian glazier was to be punished less seriously, receiving 31 lashes. However, from the social historical perspective, the most interesting part is devoted to the time between the sentencing and the execution, when significant pressure was exerted on the condemned man to convert Christianity. Indeed, much of our song is dedicated to this aspect. As part of the coercion, the two prisoners were held separately and had little contact with other Jews. However, they were permitted to use religious artifacts like tefillin and prayer books. The two prisoners were granted a visit by delegates of the Prostějov Jewish community a few days before their execution and were offered religious support. At the same time, both, and especially the younger Perez, were constantly visited by a Catholic priest who tried to convince them to undergo baptism, offering them a pardon in return. Here we should pause and say a few words about the efforts to convert Jews in the early modern Bohemian lands, because the song echoes the missionary activities of the Catholic Church among local Jews. This effort was a staple part of anti-Jewish policy since the second half of the 17th century and had an important impact on the ethos of the Yiddish song. Concentrated pressure on the Jewish community was closely tied to the state's desire to reduce the Jewish population. From the theological perspective, conversion served as a tool to affiliate a person with the majority society and, at best, to transform the Jewish identity in accordance with the Catholic faith. The Catholic Church, and especially the Jesuit order, contributed to the state's reduction policy via a mission targeted at the Jewish community. Compulsory catechesis, forcing Jews to attend special sermons, and the distribution of German prayer books and catechisms printed in Hebrew script represent just a few examples of the ways in which the Church endeavored to convert Jews. As we see in the Yiddish song, the Church exerted missionary pressure on Jews who were brought to justice for various criminal transgressions. This applied especially to those awaiting capital punishment, people who thus found themselves in a hopeless situation. They were easy prey for Catholic clergymen who offered convicted prisoners spiritual support. While the number of Jews who accepted baptism in order to avoid or mitigate their punishment was not great, each such case attracted widespread attention. Likewise, the execution in Prostějov, which started in the market square in the early morning of Maundy Thursday on March 30, attracted an extremely large crowd of spectators. Many Christians, most of them probably, expected a last-minute request to convert. It must be stressed that Christian reports of similar events completely omit and conceal the presence of a Jewish audience. A mirror image is provided by the Yiddish song, which emphasizes the attendance of local Jews, though it seems that Christian officers sought to exclude Jews from this spectacle. Nevertheless, the song confirms that Jewish leaders, including even rabbinical authorities, did their best to visit both convicted men and remain close to them until their last moments. The song, for example, mentions a historical figure, Rabbi Elchanan Shamash, son of Rabbi Issachar Cohen, a renowned scholar and the author of several Hebrew books. His role in the song is very important because he testified that both men, Bessel and Perez, recited Hebrew prayers until their death at the gallows and that they refused to convert. However, the Christian public expected something else. Last-minute requests to convert at the gallows were often described in detail, published in the form of booklets, engravings, or popular songs, and served as evidence of a miracle, since the conversion of Jews was always considered a rare event. By the 17th century, the popular genre of the Todesurteil had developed. This genre described cases in which condemned Jews converted, telling the tale of their life and crimes or enumerating every single method of torture. Thus, the Yiddish song should be understood as a counterpart or a response to these Christian reports of Jewish conversions, as an alternative narrative strengthening Jewish religious identity. Professor Elisheva Karlbach correctly notes that although baptism could mitigate the torture or the method of execution, the physical pain, it was still an integral part of public punishment, causing spiritual pain to the condemned person as well as his or her relatives and community. Punitive measures against Jewish criminals condemned to execution were far more painful and humiliating than the standard punishment of Christian criminals. While the Christian texts interpreted the acceptance of baptism by a Jew as a victory of the true faith, for the Jewish community, it created a deep, long-lasting wound. Our Yiddish song confirms that Jewish executions were orchestrated as a spectacular dark drama. Jews condemned to death went to their executions dressed as Jews, sometimes wearing their religious head coverings, their tefillin, or other items intended to humiliate or punish not only their persons, but their religion as well. Large crowds would gather to be entertained by the torture and to share the suspense of waiting to see whether the Jew would convert. In the case of Wessel and Perez, they both wear wedding garments, apparently a kittel, a long white coat worn also for various religious occasions and ultimately used as a burial shroud. Nevertheless, the two were not given tzitzit, or ritual fringes, a matter that sparked the rumor, denied by the author, that the two had converted. From the Christian perspective, accepting baptism within a liturgical ceremony stressed the pastoral role of the Church and its superior position over all components of society. A partial response to all these aspects can be found in our Yiddish text. However, it serves primarily as a polemic with successful forced conversions and as an apologetic report venerating the Jewish thieves for their religious constancy and their fidelity to Judaism. There are many examples of such cases from several parts of 16th to 18th century East Central Europe, demonstrating that missionary efforts to convert Jews were made by Catholic as well as Protestant denominations. Of particular interest are those criminal cases in which Jews from the Bohemian lands, similarly to Les Wessel and Perez, were offered a less strict punishment if they converted. For example, certain Moravian Jew from Boskovice, who stole a relatively large sum of money in the town in 1632, refused the offer of baptism and even insulted the local priest, calling him a man-whore. On the contrary, another Moravian Jew, Manasseh of Osoblaha, who was accused of forging money, avoided a cruel execution in 1624 in Nyssa, Silesia, by allowing himself to be baptized. Contemporaneous Jewish reports concerning the execution of Jewish thieves, by contrast, focus on the motive of rejecting conversion. One example is the case of the trafficker of stolen goods Yisrael Sholem Shachne in Krakow in 1682, which is described in another Yiddish song. Another instance is the morality of two thieves in Glickstadt in 1691, as recorded in the famous Yiddish memoirs of Glikel Bas Yehuda Leib. And as you will hear in the following part of our presentation, Dr. Cohen Roman will expand upon this aspect of the song. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much, Daniel. I will continue. I will share. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So thank you very much, and děkuji mnohokrát. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the Institute of the Czech Literature of the Czech Academy of Sciences, for allowing me to speak at your distinguished platform today in English. Yiddish literature is a vernacular literature that encompasses various genres. Originating from the German lands in the 10th century, in the early modern era, its readership, known as Ashkenazic Jews, lived in large parts of Europe, from Amsterdam in the west to the Black Sea in the east. The earliest literary text that has reached us in this language is a collection of poems on topics from the book of Genesis, written in 1382. Surprisingly, the manuscript containing these poems was found outside Europe, in the famous treasure trove of documents stored in a Cairo synagogue known as the Cairo Geniza. When we call Yiddish literature a Jewish literature, we mean that although its sources are both particular, i.e. from Hebrew literature, as well as universal, i.e. German and other European literatures, its intended readership has always been Jewish. As such, Yiddish texts echoed their readers' religious and social identity. For instance, in the song discussed today, the interreligious conflict regarding conversion in return for amnesty is clearly reported from a traditional Jewish perspective, seeing the choice to die and not convert as exemplary. We find a similar case in the memoirs of Glikel Hamel, an 18th century Jewish woman who relates the story of two Jewish thieves, one of whom she knew personally, who stole diamonds from a Christian burgher in Glückstadt. They were caught and sentenced to death, and, like the two thieves from Prostějov, they were offered a pardon in exchange for converting. However, unlike in our song, in Glikel's story, one of the men chose to convert and was released. Glikel harshly criticizes the convert and praises the executed man. Indeed, this exact choice, the decision not to leave the Jewish religion, even at the price of one's own life, served as a central motif in Jewish literatures in various languages since antiquity. I will talk more about this shortly. As my colleague, Dr. Soukup, mentioned, the song we're studying together belongs to the genre of historical songs within older Yiddish literature. This genre, known in other European literatures as well, represented a new method to disseminate information following the invention of print. Served the functional purpose of reporting news relatively quickly. Usually, such texts concerned extraordinary occurrences, mostly calamities such as fires, plagues, and expulsions. These songs claim to be realistic, reporting true stories, a fact that adds to the credibility of the song from Prostějov. The extant corpus of Yiddish historical songs includes some 50 works from the 17th and 18th centuries. In most cases, only one copy has survived, and it is believed that many more such songs have not reached us. The Jewish character of this genre is not limited to the choice of themes in the perspective from which the songs are narrated. Rather, such works also make reference to Hebrew liturgy. For instance, quotes and intertextual references are common, alongside formalistic borrowings, like using particular stanzaic structures or an acrostic based on the Hebrew alphabet. Indeed, our songs starts with the opening word of a Hebrew prayer recited at funerals, El Maleh Rachamim, and its stanzaic structure of 4 lines is borrowed from a particular category of liturgical poems that I will discuss shortly. Although they were printed as relatively cheap reading materials, Yiddish historical songs, as their name suggests, were meant for acoustic performance, and they usually mention the melody to which they ought to be sung. As Ashkenazic Jews did not use musical notation until the modern era, instructions regarding which melody should be used for a particular song were given using a contrafactum reference to a more well-known song. The chosen melody could serve merely as a tool to make the text more aesthetically pleasing and appealing, an important factor when speaking about a product sold in the open market. However, sometimes the melody also bears a strong character of its own that could affect the reception of the text and frame the song as sad, happy, parodic, etc. The song discussed today mentions not one, but 2 possible melodies: Nigun Akedah or Nigun Braunes Lied, with Nigun being the Hebrew and Yiddish word for melody. It was not easy, but I have been able to trace both these melodies. The Hebrew word Akedah is the name given to the story of the binding of Isaac, known in Christian thought as the sacrifice of Isaac. The melody bearing this name was used in Ashkenazic society to accompany texts in both Hebrew and Yiddish, retelling that biblical narrative. Since antiquity, this theme has been strongly associated with Jewish martyrdom known as Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name. From the Middle Ages, and particularly following the First Crusade, Jewish Ashkenazic society compared the martyred Jews of Germany, who chose death over forced conversion to Christianity, with Isaac, who also agreed to sacrifice his life for God. Stories of this Jewish martyrdom also draw parallels between the biblical figure of Abraham and medieval Jewish parents who killed their own children in order to save them from forced conversion. Returning to the melody called Akedah, in Hebrew literature, it was primarily used for the category of liturgical poems, retelling the story of the binding of Isaac. These poems always end with a request to God to remember the promise he gave to Abraham in the book of Genesis, to protect the future generations of his descendants in return for Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son. In Jewish literature, this melody was used for a similar, very popular poem on the same biblical topic, known as Yiddish Literature, the Jewish tribe. Here are 2 print editions of it from Prague, and I would like to thank Dr. Olga Sikstova of Prague, who was able to date these prints for me. Yiddish Literature explicitly connects the biblical narrative with contemporary martyrdom. In the closing words of the Prague editions, we read, Nun, ihr liebe Leid, tut on die Akede gedenken, Gottes wegen soll man sich losen brennen und hängen, which translates as, Dear people, remember the binding of Isaac. For the sake of God, you should agree to be burnt and hanged. Additional songs in Yiddish that use this melody are a song from 1670 about the expulsion of the Jewish community of Vienna, and a song requesting God's protection from an ongoing epidemic that plagued Prague in 1680. Common to all the texts sung to this melody is their tragic content. They all concern Jewish suffering, often involving tragedy within the family. Indeed, the melody of Akedah, ipso facto, invoked sadness, stemmed from a deep sense of religiosity. Together with my teacher, musicologist Professor Eliyahu Schleifer, I have written an article on this melody, and I would like to play for you now a short recording of the melody based on a notation from 1852.
Unfortunately, we don't hear it, Oren.
Oh, okay. So maybe I will sing it, not so nicely as Professor Schleifer. It's something like da 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 da. Yes. Let us move on to the second melody, Boyneslied, or Bauneslied. This has nothing to do with the color brown, but rather is connected to the city of Braunschweig and the German song Der Herr von Braunschweig. This identification is affirmed by the similar metrical structure of the two texts, stanzas of 4 lines, and especially the song's tragic content. It relates the story of a child convicted of theft and sentenced to death, whose mother, despite her effort, could not save him. And the recording will skip. Yes. We thus see that the melody does not only serve decorative purposes. Rather, it is also a tool of interpretation, signaling to the audience what kind of literary work is being presented. In our case, using the Akedah melody, drew a parallel between the 2 convicted thieves from Prostějov and the venerated medieval Jewish martyrs. This could be understood in the context that Dr. Soukup and my colleague Daniel provided. In the late 17th century, forced conversion to Christianity was an actual threat to Jews in the Czech lands. In this sense, various lines in the Prostějov song that sound trivial could in fact be intertextual elements aimed at bringing the Prostějov protagonists closer to the biblical narrative of the binding of Isaac. We read the words of young Perez in stanzas 37 to 38. He says, "All my life I have fought for my parents' sake. How lonely I leave them in their old age. Who will give them what they need or care for them?" These words can be taken at face value. However, they may also reference Isaac's similar moving concern for his parents, which does not appear in the Bible but is depicted in various Ashkenazic retellings of the story. For instance, in the Yiddish poem Yiddish Literature, or in the Hebrew exegetic work Midrash Vayosha. And I quote, "And Isaac also said to his father, 'After you will have slaughtered me and leave me, and go to my mother Sarah, and she will ask you, Where is Isaac my son? What will you tell her? And what will you do in your old age?' He answered him, 'I know that after you our days will be few. He who comforted us until you were born will comfort us from this day on.'" Similarly, the song mentions that the 2 executed men were dressed in wedding clothes. We can view this as an interesting historical detail, as my colleague Daniel explained. However, the fact that the 2 did not receive more classic Jewish garments like the tzitzit casts doubt on this possibility. This element may therefore be understood as presenting the soon-to-be-executed Perez as an Isaac figure, who in some Ashkenazic retellings of the biblical narrative is portrayed facing his death happily, like a bridegroom on his wedding day. This reading is further strengthened by the Prostějov song's description of Perez going happily to the gallows. We read, "On Thursday early in the morning, when they were to be hanged, their wedding clothes were brought before the judge. He said they should be dressed in these clothes, but they were given no arba kanfot," that's the tzitzit. And then a little further, Perez walked quite energetically, dancing and laughing. We read again in the exegetical Hebrew work Midrash Vayosha how Isaac prepared for his own sacrifice. Isaac was like a man who prepares his own bridal canopy, the chuppah, the wedding, and did it with joy. Understanding the influence of literary topoi on our text actually decreases its credibility from a historical point of view. Did all the mentioned details actually happen, or were they added in order to make for a fuller story? This kind of tension between literature and history brings to mind a similar argument between historians Robert Chazin and Ivan Marcus about the credibility of the chronicles of the First Crusade. Personally, I find this kind of argument very frustrating. Both sides argue their case well, making the concept of historical truth seem evasive. However, alongside this question, one also needs to take a cultural historical look at things and ask, how are such stories received? The fact that a certain story is retold repeatedly counts for something, even if we discern that it never really happened. It is an uncontested fact that for centuries the narratives about parents who killed their children during the First Crusade were retold in Ashkenazic culture, and they were considered an exemplary ethos. In this regard, the ethos still bears meaning, even if historians prove that its primary description was fictitious. It seems that the same applies to the song about the two men from Prostějov. Did they really refuse to convert? I tend to believe the text, but as my colleague Daniel said, in other cases, Jews facing a similar cruel dilemma succumbed and did convert. However, we possess a very interesting piece of external evidence about the cultural reception of the Prostějov song. A historical song about the plague epidemic that spread through Prague in 1713 states that the song should be sung benigun prostitzer kedushim, i.e. to the melody of the martyrs from Prostějov. Since there is no other known case of martyrs from Prostějov, this indication must refer to our song. As I said in the beginning of my paper, musical singing instructions made reference to a popular song that most people knew. We therefore have evidence that the Prostějov song from 1684 was still popular nearly 30 years after it was published. Moreover, it was so popular that its name replaced the classical Akedah melody or the Boyneslied melody. And with this observation on the circulation of the poem, we see that even convicted thieves could achieve the status of martyrs and be forgiven for their crimes when they performed an act of Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, you both, for your presentations and for this very specific story about a very specific song. I am sorry to Daniel that I didn't introduce you properly at the beginning, so I'm kind of making for it now. And this is Daniel Soukup, the head of department of the Older Literature at the Institute of the Czech Literature of the Academy of Sciences. So his credentials are in the same way incredible and admirable as credentials of Oren, Cohen, Roman. So at this moment, I I'm asking you that if you have any questions or comments to these presentations, please let us know. Discussion starts. No hands. Listen. I will ask them. Please, this is the case of petty criminal becoming something like a martyr, something like a saint. We know similar stories from Christian miracles. We know similar stories, for example, connected with Virgin Mary, with thieves who cry for her help, hanging from the gallows, and then Virgin Mary comes and saves them by holding their feet so they won't hang, and similar stories which are connected with intervention from above, from miraculous power that somehow materializes in this world. Is in this story or in similar Jewish stories that you know, is there something similar, something like let's say angelic intervention for the martyrs, or for the martyrs to be, or is it just concentrated on this image of martyrdom and of being witness to God's name and to God's power at the part of the human actor? That's my question.
Thank you for this question. The classical narrative of Kiddush Hashem, there God never does anything. So, and it describes a very tragic reality, or not reality as we said, but the ethos describes a very tragic situation. The explanation is that this is a test from God, or some kind of, this is what he wanted. It's not that he cannot do or doesn't want to help, but this is the model, and it repeats, right? It tries to explain why the people of God is being persecuted. Still, in our song, we have one small story inside the big narrative. There is one small story about divine intervention, and that is the story about the Hangman, the Executioner. He is presented as a very anti-Semitic man who's happy to execute the two Jews. And the night before the execution, he becomes crazy and runs away from town, and no one ever saw him again. And then a new executioner was appointed. So he got some kind of a punishment, a divine punishment. You can see it as a divine intervention, but it's very limited, and it's
Thank you very much. We have a question in chat from Václav Petrbok from YouTube. Is there any trace of this story, of this trial in Czech or German literature of the time?
Unfortunately, no. There are no other evidences of this case in Czech or German literature, neither in archival documents. So for us, it's very difficult to confirm the credibility of the song, let's say, or the historical part of the song. But yes, we have only this text and no other mentions about the case, unfortunately. As far as I know, if Oren can add something, no.
There was a big fire in Prostějov in 1690 where the community records most of them were destroyed. So we only have from this time a record of a log of the seats in the synagogue, and it's according to first names. And even if we would have found one of the protagonists that had a seat in the synagogue, that wouldn't have any projection about the trial. So, yeah, nothing.
There's another question in chat from YouTube, from Daniel Polakovic. Sorry, I didn't hear in lecture before. Is this ever recorded in the archival records of municipal archives of Prostějov?
Unfortunately not. Daniel Polakovic knows a lot about the Prostějov Jewish community, and we weren't successful to find anything. We also asked the Liechtenstein archive in Vienna, but unfortunately this collection is so big and so huge that it would be a big challenge to go through these materials and find something. So in the municipal archives of Prostějov there is nothing. We didn't find anything.
Hlásí se. Štěpán Balík has a question, so he can speak now.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you very much for nice lecture. I would like to ask about Nigun because I'm not very well educated in music, and it was really nice that you could describe how it was important to interpret the song also according to the Nigun. And I would like to ask if there are kind of types of the Nigun, because there are lots of types of the historical songs, like Swedish Lied and other about fire. And also, so if you could say something more about this, I would appreciate it. Thank you very much for a nice lecture.
Thank you very much for the question. We have a situation that I call prehistory, when researching melodies of Jews before the modern era, because they were transmitted orally and there's hardly any written documentation of it. So much of the information is lost. And even if the melody is transmitted from generation to generation, we're talking about a very long time, so there is a risk or a chance that they have changed. This is the starting point. Now we have some exceptions. For example, Hebraists from the 16th century wrote down the Ta'amim, the trope of reading the Torah, and it's quite similar to the living traditions from the 20th century. But this is an exception. And what we can do is look for German songs. If the melody reminds a German song, we can look for it in German books. And in terms of Hebrew, of Jewish liturgy, as I said, there is a big prehistory. Specifically with Nigun Akedah, which has been quite a popular melody because we've seen it in at least 4 works that I showed. It was a very popular melody also in the 19th century, and in this article that I wrote with Professor Schleifer about it, we found more than 10 modern notations, and they're all from different places, spanning 100 years, from almost 100, from 1840 till 1933, and they're almost identical. So, and when we investigated the melody, it looked medieval. So we suspect, but we cannot prove it with certainty, that Nigun Akedah has been preserved. There is another researcher of melodies that are mentioned in Yiddish literature, and that is Dr. Diana Matut, from Germany. I think she's currently in Halle and in Rostock. And she has a book about it, Musik und Dichtung in frühneuzeitliche Ashkenaz, if I'm not mistaken. She did amazing work about trying to find such melodies, and that's mainly from the German part. And yeah, that's I think that's most of all I can say about the rest of the melodies. Are each case has to be examined specifically. And if it's not recorded in German sources, then we know very little about it.
Thank you very much.
Do we have more questions, please? It doesn't seem so. Well then, that's the case. I'm calling it a day. Thank you very much for your presentations. Thank you very much for acquainting us with this fascinating textual tradition and with this fascinating multimedial tradition, with this kind of living tradition in which these stories that sound so medieval are so tightly connected to something long past still live deeply into 19th century and our age. Thank you very much for that. And well, good evening and good night and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.